Hello again, I am Blunty, and this is the Sony RX100, which sounds kind of like a sports car name to me, and that's kind of what it is. It's the sports car of compact cameras. It's the newest and shiniest and most powerful and biggest censored compact that Sony has on the market, and everyone's raving about it. They're calling it a DSLR equivalent kind of camera. This is the camera you have when you're not using a DSLR, but you're not missing out on much of the quality of a full-fledged DSLR. It's got a big 1-inch sensor, which is groundbreaking for a compact camera. And yet, when Nikon put a 1-inch sensor in the Nikon 1 cameras, everyone poo-pooed it. Oh, it's only a 1-inch sensor, it's too small, rah, rah, rah. But, you know, you only really notice that if you're kind of idiot who hangs around the photography nerd forums where they just love to fight about useless, stupid crap instead of going outside and shooting things. Go outside and shoot. So it's time to review the RX100. We're going to have a look at the hardware, and then I'm going to go outside and shoot some things with it and see how it actually performs in the real world. Join me, won't you? Oh, and if you're interested in the comparison about the 1-inch sensor thing, I actually did a video where I compared the Sony RX100 and the Nikon one together, head to head, shot for shot, 1-inch sensor for 1-inch sensor, and, well, it speaks for itself. You can go watch that and then come back here and watch the review of the Sony RX100. Now then, compact cameras by their very nature all look pretty much the same on the outside these days. A little palm-sized brick, often black, big disc on the front where a lens will extrude itself on command, a control dial up top next to the shutter release, maybe a flash, a 4-way pad around the back with a few shortcut buttons scattered around. The RX100 has all of this, and all of this, as you'd expect from a compact at the high end of the scale, feels extremely well built. No creaks, squeaks, wobbles to be found anywhere. On the front, that unfolding lens is another secret to the brutal power of the unassuming black slab. It's fast, quite fast in fact, at f1.8. It's also carrying that Carl Zeiss branding, which almost always is a very, very good thing. And when you combine a fast, highly engineered lens with the 1-inch sensor, which by the standards of cameras that slip into the front pocket of fashionable jeans is huge, you get a creatively fulfilling amount of control over things like the depth of field, and this is where that comparison to DSLR starts coming in. Startup time is fast, not the fastest I've seen, but fast enough to never feel inconvenienced. Everything else feels nice and responsive, with one exception, but we'll get to that in a moment. There's a shortcut menu where you can assign in whatever order you like a bunch of your most used settings or adjustments, and this is one of my very favourite features of the user interface. It makes getting to the stuff you personally use most extremely fast. There's no EVF of course, but the screen is bright and very crisp, and Sony are using their so-called white magic technology, which adds a 4th white pixel to every RGB set, which adds a bit of pop and helps keep it highly viewable even in direct sunlight. The pop-up flash, although small and about the same power as any other such built-in flash, does have a nice trick. You can pull back on its hinges to point it up to the ceiling for a nice bit of softened bounce flash. Fantastic if you're like me and you hate the almost always repellently ugly aesthetic of the front-on flash shot. This camera is very much designed with enthusiast and pros in mind, and as such it carries a huge wealth of manual control ability, most of which you can assign to the freely spinning control wheel which encircles the lens. And this feels fantastic. It's buttery smooth and has just the right amount of resistance without feeling sticky or too loose. But as a control mechanism, it does feel slightly laggy and inexact. When using it to adjust aperture, for instance, there's a lag before it responds and a lag before it stops, so dialing up a precise number becomes a little clumsy. You do eventually adjust to this behaviour, but it never feels quite as natural or as fast as it really should. And of course you can use the wheel for manual focus as well. Here that slight lagginess rears up again, but thankfully Sony have their built-in focus peaking tech, which makes the whole process wildly easy and helps negate that lagginess. As I've said before, and I'll probably say again next time I review a Sony camera with focus peaking, nobody else does this as well as they do. And that manual focus works in exactly the same way in video mode, making this, I think, the very first compact camera where you can accurately manually pull focus while recording video, and it works wonderfully. In stills mode, the RX100 dumps 20 crisp megapixels onto your memory card, but big megapixel numbers are meaningless unless the lens and sensor and the camera software all work together to actually resolve that much detail. And here, well, see for yourself. It's crisp, but without looking artificial or over-sharpened. Chromatic aberrations and other lens artifacting are kept firmly under control. And unsurprisingly, carrying one of Sony's Exmor image sensors as it does, the low light abilities are very pleasing too. Either using long exposure modes or high ISO sensitivities when you're shooting long before the sun shines, the RX100 can accommodate you in its stride, keeping noise low and discreet and colours punchy and smooth. Video mode in 4 AM lighting will also impress. Continuous autofocus kept me tracked, and the shot is as clean and artifact-free as I've ever seen managed from a camera that fits in my front pocket. In low light, which is usually where on most cameras the autofocus will reliably fail, falter, or just slowly hunt around for ages before locking onto anything, worked without issue. Sure, of course, it was a bit slower than in daylight, but using the unfathomable dark sorcery of the Sony Overlord, somehow it got a lock every time first time. Image stabilization is just as good as you'd expect from Sony these days. Like their focus peaking, they're the leaders of the pack when it comes to image stabilization, and it's even more important than ever when you've got a camera this small. Things with small mass don't have much inertia, which means they're more vulnerable to hideous jittery footage, but as you can see, it's so not an issue here. The zoom works nice and smoothly and, more importantly for video, quietly. And while you can disable this, the default behavior in video mode, once the end of the optical zoom is reached, is to continue zooming in using Sony's digital trickery of clear image zoom. It works fine. It's perhaps a little bit soft and I wouldn't use it if I were filming anything quote-unquote serious, but if you just need that extra bit of reach, it'll do fine. Interestingly, the default behavior in stills mode is to disable clear image zoom, probably because, as I discovered when I recently reviewed the Sony HX20, the paint daub blotchy softness of that clear image zoom is something the people who this camera is aimed at would rather avoid, but it's there if you just really need some extra reach. The dynamic range is nice. It's not blow you out of the water impressive. Shadows can get a little bit crushed sometimes, but there's also several levels of high dynamic range and extended dynamic range modes built in, and these work very well indeed, churning out pleasant, smooth results and avoiding that typically badly artificial feeling HDR look that some people love but many people hate. Sony keeps things looking natural and clean, except it seems with water at night. This is the one and only time the built-in HDR got all kind of funky on me, but still, crop out the weirdness at the bottom and it's still a damn fine snap, even if I do say so myself. Having full manual control, which you can adjust on the fly in video mode by the way, is superb. I've shown this kind of example before, but having full manual control over your camera can mean the difference between shots like this or this. And it's even more important in video mode, where the contrast between automatic settings and a properly set up manual shot is dramatic, and can mean the difference between hideous cheap looking footage and footage that does not make you want to pluck out the eyes of the person who shot it and then your own. Strangely though, the video mode choices are surprisingly limited. In MP4 mode you get just one awkward resolution of 1440 by 1080, 30p, and also a why is it even there, what barbarous lunatic still shoots at 640 by 480 mode. And in AVCHD you get all full HD 1920 by 1080, but only at 50i or 50p. Or 60R, 60p if you're in North America, which caught me by surprise, and which will certainly disappoint those who love their 24p modes, which deliver that so-called more cinematic look. In any case, it's nice to have 50p there, because when you conform that 50p down to a 25p timeline, you get a very nice, perfectly crisp and absolutely smooth half-speed slow-mo. There are the usual sprinkling of effects modes. I don't know why. I doubt anyone who selects this camera will be using them, and if they do, they've got more money than ability, quite frankly. Most of the effects are hideous. The rest are better left to post-processing software, so you can tweak it to work best with whatever image you're actually working on. It's an unexpected splash of amateur crap in this otherwise serious shooter cocktail, but then again, if you are so offended, it's easy to leave them buried in a submenu and try to forget they ever existed. However, the built-in sweep panorama mode works beautifully, easily stitching together a seamless vista in one sweep. And of course, it works just as well vertically as it does across the horizon. There's really not much to dislike about this camera. Any weakness I can point out can also be called a strength. It's very small, and at times it felt a bit fiddly because it's so small, but then again, it's so small, which means I can put this camera of gobsmacking ability in my pocket. I will say I hate the way the HDMI port is buried on the bottom right next to the tripod slot, so if you haven't mounted on a tripod plate or a tripod directly, you cannot get to it. But I do love the fact that it charges up via a mini USB port, completely standard and easy to find. The control ring is a bit vague at times, but then again it's vastly better than trying to adjust focus, aperture, frame rate, or exposure compensation and the like from a little dial on the back of the camera, and conceivably the responsiveness and accuracy could be tweaked in a firmware update to work a little better, and I'd certainly rather have the ring than be without it. The battery life isn't anything special, rated about 330 shots a charge, but that's pretty standard these days. It doesn't shine or sink on that score. The extremely limited choices in video frame rate is a frustration, but then again, if we can't get 24p or 25p, at least we get 50p, instead of something less useful for serious filmmaking like 30p. The bright f1.8 lens is fantastic, and the zoom range of 28 to 100mm in full frame terms is very useful and flexible, but I do wish it didn't have to stop all the way down to f4.9 at the far end of the zoom. It's currently the most expensive camera in its class, but then again it's arguably the very best camera in its class, particularly for video freaks. There are shooters out there claiming things like you could intercut video from this camera with that shot on a $6,000 DSLR rig and get away with it seamlessly, and you know what? I believe them. In the right hands, this camera can and will do simply astonishing things. The RX100 sets a new high watermark for enthusiast level compact cameras. As far as I'm concerned, it's a deeply rewarding tool to go and shoot with. Oh my yes, it's a very good time to be a photo nerd. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and I'll catch you next time.